The courtroom was cold, not just from the air conditioning humming in the background, but from the way power sat so arrogantly at the front of the room. Judge Thomas Reynolds leaned back in his chair, barely concealing his smirk as he stared down at the woman standing before him. She was calm, composed, and unshaken, despite the weight of the trial pressing down on her. He had seen hundreds like her before, people who thought they could walk into his courtroom and get fair treatment. But fair wasn't how he played the game. Power belonged to those who knew how to wield it, and in his mind, this woman was just another person who had no idea what she was up against. "So, Miss Harper," the judge drawled, flipping through a file as if he wasn't the least bit interested in its contents. "You really think you're going to walk in here and tell me how to do my job?" The room was silent. The bailiffs stood still, their expressions unreadable. The attorneys shifted in their seats, waiting for what would happen next. But the woman, Camille Harper, didn't flinch. She clasped her hands in front of her and took a slow breath. Her dark eyes never left the judge's face, steady and unreadable. The tension in the room grew heavier. The judge chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if this was all a joke. "I've seen it all before," he continued, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "People come in here thinking they're smarter than me. They think the law is on their side. But the law is just words, Miss Harper. And words don't mean much when I decide how this case ends." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Camille remained still. That's when the shift happened. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her bag. The bailiffs tensed, ready to intervene, but all she pulled out was a small leather wallet. With a flick of her fingers, she opened it and held it up for the room to see. The judge's smirk faltered. The attorneys sat up straighter. A few gasps broke the silence as everyone recognized the insignia stamped in gold inside the wallet. Camille Harper wasn't just anyone. She was CIA. And not just any agent. She was the corporate chief, one of the highest-ranking officials in the agency. Judge Reynolds' face drained of color. His fingers tightened around the gavel as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The arrogance in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else, something he hadn't expected to feel today. Fear. Before anyone could say a word, Camille leaned forward just slightly, her voice as calm as ever. "Your Honor," she said, tilting her head, "I think you might want to reconsider your tone." The entire courtroom was frozen, the weight of her words settling like a heavy stone. Judge Reynolds swallowed hard, his mind racing, but before he could respond, the doors to the courtroom swung open. And that's when everything changed. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they swung open, making every head in the courtroom turn. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their expressions blank, their movements precise. They didn't need to say who they were. The sharp-eyed crowd knew the look of federal agents when they saw them. Judge Reynolds gripped the gavel, so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath hitched in his throat, though he quickly tried to mask it with a cough. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room, but the power had already shifted. Camille didn't move. She simply slid her badge back into her bag and folded her hands in front of her, waiting. It was as if she had already predicted this moment, as if she had known exactly how the judge would react. One of the agents, a tall man with a buzz cut and piercing gray eyes, stepped forward and handed a folder to the clerk. Without a word, the clerk rushed it over to the judge's bench, her hands shaking slightly as she placed it in front of him. Reynolds hesitated before flipping it open. His eyes darted over the pages, scanning the official seals, the signatures, the undeniable proof of what was happening. His mouth pressed into a thin line as a bead of sweat formed at his temple. "This," he started, his voice cracking slightly before he steadied it. "This is highly irregular." Camille raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" The agent with the buzz cut took another step forward, his voice low but firm. "We suggest you proceed with caution, Your Honor. There are eyes on this case far beyond this courtroom." The judge looked up, his face a mixture of anger and uncertainty. He was used to being the one with the final say, the man in control. But now, the game had changed, and the realization settled uncomfortably in his chest. For a moment, he considered pushing back, exerting what little authority he still had. But something in Camille's gaze made him think twice. There was no desperation in her eyes, no pleading, just patience, as if she already knew how this would end. The room was so silent that even the sound of the clock ticking on the wall felt deafening. The spectators, the attorneys, even the bailiffs seemed frozen, waiting for the next move. Finally, the judge let out a slow breath and closed the folder. He placed his hands on the desk, fingers trembling just slightly before he curled them into fists. "We will take a short recess," he announced, his voice tight. 15 minutes. And with that, he slammed the gavel down, far harder than necessary, before standing up and retreating to his chambers without another word. As soon as he was gone, the tension in the room shattered into murmurs and whispers. People turned to each other, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Camille exhaled softly, barely noticeable, before turning to the agents. They gave her a small nod before stepping back toward the door, resuming their watchful stance. She wasn't surprised by the judge's reaction. She had dealt with men like him before, powerful on the surface, but weak when confronted with something they couldn't control. As she gathered her belongings, preparing for whatever came next, she felt a pair of eyes on her. From across the room, a teenage boy sat on one of the back benches, his hands clasped tightly together. He had been watching the entire scene unfold with wide, curious eyes. He wasn't like the others who whispered and speculated. He simply observed, his expression unreadable. Camille met his gaze, studying him for a brief moment before he quickly looked away. Something about him stood out, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She made a mental note to find out more, because in her experience, nothing in a courtroom like this happened by coincidence. As Camille adjusted the strap of her bag and moved toward the exit, she could still feel the weight of the boy's gaze. Even though he had looked away, there was something about him that lingered in her mind. He was young, maybe 16 or 17, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, but his eyes held something far older. Something careful. She didn't have time to dwell on it now. There were bigger things at play, and she had learned long ago to trust her instincts. For now, she let it go, but not before committing his face to memory. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with quiet conversations. Lawyers huddled in corners, speculating. The judge's sudden retreat hadn't gone unnoticed, and everyone wanted to know what had just happened. Camille walked with purpose, ignoring the stares. She wasn't here for gossip. She was here for something much bigger. And she knew this case wasn't just about the law. It was about power. As she reached the end of the corridor, one of the agents fell and stepped beside her. He was the taller one, the one with the sharp gray eyes. "Judge Reynolds is rattled," he said in a low voice. "More than I expected." Camille nodded slightly, because he knows exactly what's at stake. The agent's gaze flicked around the hallway, scanning for eavesdroppers before lowering his voice even more. "Are we sure he's the only one involved?" Camille exhaled slowly. That was the real question, wasn't it? Corruption like this never worked in isolation. Judge Reynolds had power, yes, but he wasn't untouchable. Someone had been protecting him. Someone had made him feel invincible for a long time. And that meant there were more people in the shadows. She stopped walking and turned slightly, lowering her voice. "We're close, but we're not there yet. If we push too hard too soon, they'll bury everything before we can get to the truth." The agent nodded, understanding. There were forces at play here that ran deeper than just a corrupt judge laughing at a woman in his courtroom. There was something much bigger lurking beneath the surface. Before they could continue, a voice called out from behind. "Miss Harper." Camille turned to see the teenage boy from the courtroom standing a few steps away, shifting slightly on his feet, as if debating whether he had made the right decision to speak up. The agent stiffened beside her, but Camille remained relaxed, tilting her head slightly. "Yes." The boy hesitated, glancing at the agent before focusing on Camille. I just wanted to say that was pretty cool. What you did in there." A small smile ghosted across Camille's lips, but she studied him carefully. There was something behind his words, something more than just admiration. "Thank you," she said simply. "What's your name?" "Jaden." "Nice to meet you, Jaden." She glanced back toward the courtroom doors, then back at him. "You were sitting in the back. What brought you here today?" Jaden hesitated again, his fingers tightening around the straps of his backpack. For a moment, it seemed like he was debating whether to say anything at all. I don't know," he finally said. "I come here sometimes. Just to watch." Camille raised an eyebrow. "To watch?" He nodded, shifting again. My mom used to be a lawyer. Before he trailed off, looking away for a second. Before things changed, Camille didn't push. She recognized the way he carried himself, the way some people learn to move carefully through the world, staying quiet, watching everything. I see, she said gently. And what did you think about what happened in there? Jaden hesitated again, then finally met her eyes. I think the judge was scared. Camille held his gaze. Smart kid. He was, she agreed. Jaden glanced around, lowering his voice. And I think that means you just made yourself a target. The agent beside Camille shifted slightly, his expression unreadable, but Camille only nodded. She wasn't surprised by Jaden's observation. In fact, she had been waiting for someone else to realize it. She studied the boy for another moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card. She handed it to him. If you ever see or hear anything, call me, she said. Jaden looked at the card, then back at her, nodding slowly before tucking it into his pocket. As he turned to leave, Camille watched him disappear down the hall, her mind already turning over possibilities. The boy was observant, careful, and something told her he was connected to this case in ways she didn't yet understand. The agent beside her waited until Jaden was out of sight before speaking. You think he knows something? Camille exhaled softly. I think he will. And with that, she turned and kept walking. Because the game wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. The night air was thick with tension as Camille stepped out of the courthouse, her heels clicking against the pavement. The city lights flickered in the distance, but she barely noticed. Her mind was moving too fast, pieces of the puzzle shifting, connecting in ways that made her uneasy. Judge Reynolds had been caught off guard, but that didn't mean he was done playing the game. If anything, men like him fought harder when they felt cornered. And she knew he wasn't working alone. The corruption ran deeper than one man sitting behind a bench. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, already expecting bad news. A message flashed across the screen. No name, just a number she didn't recognize. You should have left this alone. She let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the phone. It wasn't the first threat she had received, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about this one felt different. A low voice interrupted her thoughts. I was wondering when they'd make their move. She turned to see the agent with the sharp gray eyes leaning casually against a nearby car. He had followed her out, hands tucked in his pockets like this was just another night. But Camille knew better. He was just as alert as she was. They're testing me, she said, showing him the message. He glanced at it, his jaw tightening. They're watching. They always are. The agent exhaled through his nose, scanning the street. We need to move. Reynolds won't just sit back and wait for this to play out. He's got connections, and if he's scared, that means someone bigger is pulling the strings. Camille nodded, slipping her phone back into her pocket. Then we find out who. They had just turned toward their car when a movement in the corner of her eye made Camille stop. Across the street, standing half hidden in the shadows, was Jaden. He wasn't moving, just watching. Camille exchanged a quick glance with the agent before crossing the street. Jaden didn't flinch as she approached, but there was something in his expression, something unsettled. I thought I told you to call if you had something to say, she said quietly. Jaden swallowed, shifting on his feet. I didn't want to wait. She studied him, waiting. He took a breath. I think I know why the judge was scared. Camille felt the tension coil tighter in her chest. Go on. Jaden glanced around before lowering his voice. I heard my mom talking about him once. Before she disappeared. The words hit her like a cold wind. Camille's mind immediately sharpened, focusing. Disappeared? Jaden nodded, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. She was working on something. A case. She told me if anything ever happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. Camille felt the weight of the moment settle between them. The pieces were starting to align, and she didn't like what she was seeing. What was your mom's name? She asked carefully. Jaden hesitated, then answered. Naomi Carter. The name sent a chill down her spine. She knew that name. A former prosecutor. A fighter. Someone who had been looking into high-level corruption before she suddenly went off the grid. Official reports had called it a disappearance, but Camille had always suspected something darker. And now, standing here, looking into Jaden's eyes, she knew she had been right. This wasn't just about Judge Reynolds. This was bigger. Before she could say another word, the sharp sound of tires screeching against pavement shattered the air. A black SUV barreled around the corner, speeding toward them. Jaden's eyes widened. Camille's instincts kicked in. "Move," she shouted, grabbing him and pulling him toward cover as the vehicle skidded to a stop. The back door flew open, and masked men jumped out. And in that moment, Camille knew. Whoever they were up against wasn't just trying to scare them anymore. They were making their move. Camille's pulse pounded in her ears as she yanked Jaden behind a parked car, shielding him with her body. The masked men moved fast, too fast for common street criminals. Their precision, their formation, it screamed professional. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a hit. The agent across the street was already drawing his weapon, his sharp eyes locking onto the threat, but before he could react, the SUV's driver hit the gas, angling the vehicle to block his line of sight. Camille didn't hesitate. She grabbed Jaden's wrist and hissed, "Run." Jaden barely had time to react before she pulled him into a full sprint, weaving between cars as shouts erupted behind them. Heavy boots pounded against the pavement. They were being chased. Jaden was fast, but fear made him clumsy. He stumbled over a curb, but Camille tightened her grip and yanked him forward. "Keep going," she urged. A gunshot cracked through the air. A car window exploded just feet away from them, glass raining onto the sidewalk. People on the street screamed, ducking for cover. Camille's mind was racing. Who were these men? Why were they coming after them now? Jaden gasped beside her, but he didn't stop running. "Who are they?" he choked out. "I don't know," Camille admitted, scanning for an escape route. They needed to disappear fast. She spotted an alley up ahead and yanked Jaden toward it. The moment they slipped into the darkness, she pushed him against the wall, pressing a finger to her lips. They were hidden but not safe. Heavy footsteps thundered past the entrance of the alley. The men hadn't seen them slip inside yet. Jaden's breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Camille placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Stay quiet." Seconds stretched into eternity. The men outside were speaking, their voices low and clipped. She couldn't make out their words, but she didn't need to. They were searching. Then, just as she thought they might move on, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The sound was small, almost imperceptible, but in the thick silence of the alley, it might as well have been an explosion. A voice snapped from outside. "There." In the alley, Camille cursed under her breath. Jaden's eyes went wide with panic. They had no choice now. She grabbed his hand again and bolted deeper into the alley. The men were right behind them. At the end of the alley, a chain-link fence blocked their way. Camille didn't slow down. With one fluid motion, she leaped onto the metal, climbing with practiced speed. Jaden hesitated for half a second before following her lead. But he wasn't fast enough. A hand grabbed his ankle. Jaden yelped, kicking wildly, trying to break free. Camille twisted around, locking eyes with the masked man below. Without thinking, she swung her foot down, slamming her heel into his wrist. The man grunted, his grip loosening just enough. Jaden scrambled over the fence, dropping hard onto the other side. Camille landed beside him, grabbing his arm and yanking him back into motion. "We need to." A second SUV screeched around the corner ahead of them, cutting off their escape. More men. More trouble. They were surrounded. Jaden's breath hitched. "What do we do?" Camille's mind worked fast. They couldn't outrun this. Not now. Then her phone buzzed again. She glanced down. A message. From an unknown number. "Get in the car behind you. Now." Her heart lurched. She turned sharply, just in time to see a black sedan parked at the mouth of a side street, its back door wide open. The engine was running. A trap? Maybe. But they had no other choice. She grabbed Jaden's wrist. "Come on." Before he could argue, she dragged him toward the car and threw them both inside. The second they were in, the door slammed shut and the driver hit the gas. The men outside barely had time to react before the sedan peeled away, tires screeching as it disappeared into the city. Camille spun toward the front seat, ready for fight. Who the hell? Then she froze. Because sitting in the driver's seat was a woman. And not just any woman. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. Mom. Camille's heart pounded. Naomi Carter. A woman who was supposed to be dead. Jaden's voice barely left his lips, but the weight of that single word, Mom, filled the space like a shockwave. His body tensed beside Camille, frozen in disbelief. Naomi Carter didn't look at him right away. Her eyes were locked on the road, her grip on the wheel tight as she took a sharp turn, tires screeching against the pavement. The city lights blurred past, but inside the car, time seemed to stand still. Camille watched Jaden's face shift from shock to something raw, something broken. He had spent years thinking his mother was dead. And now, here she was, driving like a woman who had never stopped running. Finally, Naomi exhaled. I didn't want you to see me like this, she said, her voice controlled but heavy. Jaden's hands curled into fists. Like what? He demanded, his voice cracking. Like someone who faked her own death? Like someone who left me? Naomi flinched, but she didn't slow down. I never left you, Jaden, she said. I was taken off the board before I had a choice. Camille leaned forward. We don't have time for riddles.
Who were those men?
Who's behind this? Naomi's grip tightened. Judge Reynolds was just the surface. The real power sits above him. People who operate so far outside the law that they control it. Jaden shook his head. Then why did they come after us? Naomi's jaw clenched. Because you're my son. The words hit like a punch. Jaden went still. Camille's stomach dropped. It wasn't about what Jaden had seen. It wasn't about Judge Reynolds at all. The second he stepped into that courtroom, he had become a loose end. A threat. And the people in power didn't let threats walk away. Naomi took another sharp turn, glancing at Camille through the rearview mirror. They won't stop.
Not now.
We have to end this. Camille nodded, her mind racing. Do you have proof? Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with her free hand, she reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small flash drive. This, she said. Years of data. Names, transactions, locations. Everything they never wanted to see the light of day. Jaden's eyes widened. Then we exposed them. Naomi exhaled. It's not that simple. You don't go up against people like this and walk away. Camille met her gaze. Then we make sure we don't do it alone. She pulled out her phone and dialed. A single ring before the call connected. A steady voice answered. You have it. Camille glanced at the flash drive in Naomi's hand. Yes. The voice on the other end paused. Then, get to the location.
Now.
Before Camille could respond, headlights flared in the rearview mirror. A black SUV. Gaining fast. Naomi cursed under her breath. Hold on. She slammed the gas pedal, weaving through traffic, but the SUV didn't hesitate. It pushed forward, closing the distance. Another vehicle appeared on the right. Then another.
They were being boxed in. Camille spun around.
They won't risk shooting in public, but they'll force us to crash. Naomi's knuckles turned white on the wheel. Not if I crash them first. With a sudden, brutal swerve, she clipped the SUV's front bumper. The driver overcorrected, just enough. The vehicle spun, slamming into a street pole. But the others kept coming. Jaden clung to his seat, his breath ragged. What do we do? Camille didn't hesitate. She yanked the flash drive from Naomi's grip. We split up. They can't chase all of us. Naomi's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she nodded. There's an alley up ahead. I'll draw them. You run. Jaden's head snapped toward her. No. But Naomi didn't wait for his protest. She veered left, toward the alley. The moment the tires screeched to a stop, Camille shoved the car door open and grabbed Jaden's arm. Move. Jaden hesitated, torn between staying and going. Naomi turned, locking eyes with her son. I love you, Jaden, she said, her voice steady. Now run. Tears burned in Jaden's eyes, but Camille didn't let him freeze. She yanked him hard, and together, they bolted. Behind them, the sound of car doors slamming open echoed through the alley. More men. More footsteps. Camille didn't dare look back. The only way to win was to survive. And the only way to survive was to expose the truth. Camille and Jaden ran, their breaths sharp and fast, feet pounding against the pavement as the alley stretched into darkness. Every muscle in Jaden's body screamed for him to stop, to turn back, to go after his mother. But the sound of tires screeching and men shouting behind them made it clear. Naomi had given them a chance. They had to take it. The alley opened onto a quiet side street, dimly lit and lined with parked cars. Camille scanned their surroundings, pulling Jaden into the shadows behind a dumpster. She pressed her back against the cold metal, listening. The footsteps in the alley were getting closer. Jaden tried to catch his breath, his hands shaking. "She's still back there," he whispered. Camille grabbed his shoulders. She knew what she was doing. "We have the drive. That's what matters." Tears burned at the edges of Jaden's eyes, but he swallowed them down. He clenched his fists and nodded. Camille pulled out her phone and dialed the number again. It rang once.
Twice.
The same steady voice answered. "Do you have it?" She exhaled.
Yes.
"We're compromised. We need an extraction now." The line went dead. Jaden's heart pounded. "What now?" Camille glanced down the street. "We move." They ducked low and slipped between cars, keeping to the shadows. The city was alive around them. Music from a nearby bar, the hum of distant traffic, but the danger still pressed in close. Then, suddenly, a pair of headlights flicked on. A black sedan rolled up, slow and controlled. Camille tensed, ready to run again, until she recognized the driver. The agent from before, the one with the sharp gray eyes. He leaned over, pushing the passenger door open. "Get in." Jaden hesitated for only a second before diving into the back seat. Camille followed, slamming the door shut just as the tires spun into motion. The agent didn't speak as he navigated through the city, keeping his hands steady on the wheel. Only when they had put several blocks between them and the alley did he glance at the rearview mirror. "Where's Naomi?" Jaden looked down, jaw tight. Camille answered for him. "She gave us an opening. She knew they'd chase her." The agent exhaled sharply but didn't argue. He already knew what that meant. Jaden's voice was barely a whisper. "She's not coming back, is she?" Silence filled the car. Camille wanted to say something to soften the truth, to give him hope. But she had spent too many years in this world to make empty promises. The agent turned onto a quieter road, pulling into an underground parking garage. "We don't let her sacrifice go to waste." They got out of the car and hurried into an unmarked office space. Inside, a row of computers and surveillance monitors flickered, their glow casting long shadows on the walls. A few agents sat at desks, typing furiously, eyes flicking between screens. The agent took the flash drive from Camille and plugged it into the main console. The room fell silent as files opened one by one, spreadsheets, wire transfers, confidential memos. It was all there. Names, dates, proof of every deal, every bribe, every crime that Judge Reynolds and his powerful connections had worked so hard to keep buried. Jaden stepped forward, staring at the screen. "This is it," he said, voice barely above a whisper. This is what she was trying to expose. Camille turned to the agent. "We leak it. Everything." He nodded. Already in motion. Within minutes, files were being uploaded, encrypted emails were sent, news outlets were pinged. The truth was out. Jaden watched the screen, his face unreadable. He had spent years wondering what happened to his mother.
Now he knew.
And though the pain of losing her still sat heavy in his chest, there was something else too. Something steadier. A quiet, burning determination. Camille placed a hand on his shoulder. "She would have been proud of you." Jaden swallowed hard, blinking quickly, and gave a small nod. The agent's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, then looked up. "It's done. Reynolds is being arrested. And not just him. His whole network is unraveling." Relief washed over Camille, but it was bittersweet. Justice had come, but at a cost. Jaden turned toward the window, looking out at the city. "So what now?" Camille followed his gaze. "Now we keep moving forward." The truth was out. The corruption had been exposed. And though the fight wasn't over, they had won this battle. Jaden squared his shoulders, his mother's strength shining through him. No more running. No more hiding. It was time to build something new.